Tess Taylor, and I'm a Community Education Specialist at MDA. We're thrilled to have you join us for today's webinar, Updates in Research and Care for LGMD. This learning event is part of our larger MDA community education program, which focuses on bringing the neuromuscular disease community together around education and resources. Be sure to visit the community education section at mda.org for updates on upcoming events, including a live Q&A for LGMD Awareness Day on September 30th, 2024 at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Our live Q&A will feature today's presenter, Dr. Peter Kang, as well as other neuromuscular professionals who can answer your questions regarding LGMD. For more information and to view other recent and upcoming LGMD webinars, please click on the link in the description box below. For nearly 75 years, MDA has led the way in funding research to accelerate the development of new treatments, expanding access to care and clinical trials through the MDA Care Center Network, and advocating for access and inclusion for the neuromuscular disease community. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Peter Kang. Peter B. Kang is a pediatric neuromuscular neurologist and physician scientist. He is the director of the Greg Marzolf Jr. Muscular Dystrophy Center at the University of Minnesota, where he serves as professor and vice chair of research for the Department of Neurology. His research has focused on solving patient-related genetic and genomic puzzles in muscular dystrophy for 2 decades, including the discovery and characterization of novel muscular dystrophy genes. Dr. Kang has worked with MDA for 2 decades. He has been awarded 2 grants from MDA, has presented at the MDA Clinical and Scientific Conference, and has contributed to patient and family-focused educational activities sponsored by the MDA. In 2022, he was appointed to the MDA Research and Advisory Council. He is president of the Child Neurology Society and is an associate editor of Muscle and Nerve. Dr. Kang, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing this information with us. I will now stop sharing my slides and turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Tess, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation from the MDA. I will pull up my slides now. Okay, so today we'll be discussing updates in research and care for LGMD, as Tess mentioned. These are my disclosures. So today we'll go over history and classification, as that provides some helpful background for patients with some of the terminology. We'll go through diagnosis, current treatment options, research and clinical trials, and lastly, how to discuss treatment options with your doctor and care team. So let's go into history and classification. So for a very long time, people have recognized that there are multiple types of muscular dystrophy, but the terminology has changed over the years. It was really in the 1950s that the term limb-girdle muscular dystrophy started to be used. And then the modern terminology for just categorizing muscular dystrophy in general emerged in the 1960s. So this list is from an article from the 1950s, and you can see that there's starting to be more of a differentiation between Duchenne muscular dystrophy and other types of muscular dystrophies. But a lot of the terms are kind of unfamiliar to us today because they have evolved over the years. And then by the 1960s, you're starting to see a little bit more terminology that's familiar. In particular, category number 3 is limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So the term came about in the 1950s, and by the 1960s, it was becoming more and more commonly used. It took a while for the terminology to clarify a bit more. There was one term that was relatively older that was used for quite a while still, even beyond the 1960s, called severe childhood autosomal recessive muscular dystrophy, or SCARMD. And if you look at old articles from the mid-20th century and sometimes even into the late 20th century, you'll see that term for a while. And that's sort of recognized now as a subtype of LGMD, and it's not really used anymore because it's not genetically distinct. So the genes for LGMD began to emerge in the 1990s. There was an explosion of discovery that began in the 1980s when the Duchenne muscular dystrophy gene was cloned. And it really began to bear fruit for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy in the 1990s. Calpain-3 was the first gene described. And as more and more genes were described, even in the 1990s, it became clear that not only did we need a term for LGMD, but we needed subtypes of LGMD, and to make it as clear as possible. So a classification system emerged in the 1990s, and what they started out with was dominant forms of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy were called LGMD1, and recessive forms were called LGMD2. And then for each of those, dominant and recessive, you went through the letters of the alphabet. So as I mentioned, calpain was the first recessive gene that was discovered. So it was called limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2A. And then you'd go on to 2B for dysferlin, et cetera, going down the list. So that was pretty straightforward for a couple decades, from about 1990s to the 2010s. A bunch of more genes were discovered and everything seemed to be fine. However, in 2016, a gene that was assigned to limb-girdle type 2Z was discovered. That meant that we now had 26 recessive limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. And so we were at the end of the alphabet, and a dilemma that wasn't anticipated in the 1990s presented itself, namely, how would we name more than 26 different subtypes of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy for either recessive or dominant? So there was another workshop that was convened in 2017 to discuss what to do next, and a new classification system was proposed. And I think it's especially important for families and patients to be aware of these systems, because you will see terminology in the medical record, your own medical record or your child's medical record, referring to some of these terms. And there's still sort of a transition going on. And so you'll see sometimes the old terminology and sometimes the new. And they are roughly equivalent, but not exactly. And so before, the dominant dystrophies were referred to as LGMD1 with letters assigned at the end. In the new system, the dominant limb-girdle muscular dystrophies are called LGMD-D, D for dominant, and then numbers are assigned at the end so that there is no limit to how many numbers you can assign, and so we don't run into that problem again. And then the recessive ones were referred to as LGMD2, and now they're referred to as LGMDR, again with numbers assigned at the end. So there's not exactly a one-to-one transition, but there are a lot of commonalities. Limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2A became limb-girdle muscular dystrophy R1, and they're both associated with calpain, and so on. So you can see that sometimes the numbers and the letters track, but not always. As a result of this workshop, a whole list of proposed limb-girdle muscular dystrophies with the new classification system was proposed, and that's the system that's being used now, although, again, there are individuals who prefer the older terminology. There are patient organizations who prefer the older terminology. So a lot of people are trying to use both, and just to make sure that we're being as inclusive and communicating as well as possible. So this is just to give everyone an idea of what's happened to our understanding of muscle and muscle disease in the past several decades. There's the actin and myosin, which a lot of you have heard about. These are the proteins that help with muscle contraction and are key proteins in that movement, so that muscle can shorten or expand depending on the situation. But now we know that in addition to that, there's dozens and dozens of proteins encoded by genes that are linked to muscular dystrophy, which indicates that this is a fairly complex and delicate mechanism. Mutations that affect proteins in a lot of these structures can lead to muscle dysfunction and some form of muscular dystrophy. So let's move on to diagnosis. Why is genetic diagnosis important? Well, if you have a genetic diagnosis, the prognosis can be more specific. You can design regimens for supportive therapies. It's important for genetic counseling and family planning. There's also eligibility for new molecular therapies that might target specific genes and even specific variant types. And this goes for both clinical trials and what we hope will be approved therapies in the future. One terminology point I'd like to make is that pathogenic variant is a technical term, and it's very similar to the term mutation. So We sometimes use them interchangeably. In scientific literature, you'll probably see, especially in more recent articles, that the term pathogenic variant is used more, and then in older articles, you'll see mutation. But they're very similar in terms of what they mean. So another inspiration for genetic diagnosis is that therapies are being approved for neuromuscular disorders, and they're becoming increasingly voluminous. So for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there are now 8 FDA-approved therapies. For spinal muscular dystrophy, there are 3. And the list will keep growing, and we anticipate that there will be therapies approved for LGMD in the near future. And genetic diagnosis is important because of gene-specific and sometimes variant-specific therapies. There are some Duchenne muscular dystrophy therapies, for example, that apply only to specific types of genetic variants or mutations. We do need therapies that can target as many genes and variants as possible. And as I mentioned, at this time, there are no FDA-approved therapies for LGMD. I do hope that that changes before too much longer. It is really important to help drive towards new therapies to find and diagnose all affected individuals as accurately as possible. As you know, these are rare diseases, and for clinical trials, we want to gather as many patients as we can up to the limit of what the enrollment is. And so the faster we can meet enrollment targets, the faster we can determine whether or not a new therapy is working or not. So what are the steps to a diagnosis? For limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, you want a comprehensive evaluation in a neuromuscular clinic, ideally multidisciplinary, but that becomes more important for care later on, which we'll discuss. You want a good history and physical examination, documentation of muscle weakness. A serum test called a CK level is pretty standard, and it's been around for decades, and that can help determine whether the muscle is irritated or not. Nowadays, genetic testing is the gold standard for confirming the diagnosis. That is when the results are clear. Sometimes they're not clear, as we'll discuss. And there's clinical genetic testing and then also research studies that you can participate in if you don't have a clear answer from clinical genetic testing. Muscle biopsy has been around for quite a long time. It continues to be useful when the genetic test results are not informative or if they're ambiguous and it's not really clear how to interpret the genetic test results. Electromyography, or EMG, is also an older diagnostic technique. It's not used very much in diagnosing LGMD these days, although it may be done from time to time if the CK level is normal and the actual overall diagnosis itself is a little bit ambiguous. So there are times when patients with LGMD may still benefit from an EMG. So genomic tools have evolved dramatically over the past couple of decades. There are traditional genetic tests that were done on patients from the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we have a whole array of new tests that are increasingly common. There's microarrays, next generation sequencing, transcriptome sequencing, also known as RNA-seq. And now there is an even more sophisticated form of genome sequencing called long-read sequencing. What is unfortunately a fact of genetic testing for muscular dystrophies is that there's no genetic test or no single genetic test that can pick up all types of muscular dystrophies and all types of genetic variants. We hope that someday we will have a single test that can do that, but we're not there yet. It is important to know that there are patients out there with LGMD that don't have complete genetic diagnoses or sometimes no genetic information at all, even after standard genetic testing is done. So based on what's been published in the literature, we estimate that about half of patients with LGMD have a clear genetic diagnosis. And then there are others who have some ambiguity and others who have no indication on their genetic test of what is going on with them in terms of their genetic background. So where are the missing genetic diagnoses? I mentioned partial genetic answers. So there are a lot of limb-girdle muscular dystrophies where you're supposed to have 2 mutations or 2 genetic variants, one on each copy of the gene. And there are some people who have a damaging variant on one copy of the gene, but not the other. And that leads to some ambiguity. Is that really the right diagnosis or not? You also have what's called variants of unknown significance, commonly abbreviated VUS, and that complicates matters significantly because that also leads to some ambiguity. What that means is that there's a change in your DNA, but it's not clear if it's disease causing or not. And that, as you can imagine, can be very confusing, both for healthcare providers and for patients. And then there are patients who, when you do standard genetic testing, you don't find anything at all. There are novel genes still being found, including some dominant ones. And then there are some variant types that are not always detected on clinical genetic testing. There are sometimes splice site mutations, and that's getting to be a little technical, but it's a specific type of mutation that isn't easily picked up. And then structural variants, which are bigger changes in DNA. And depending on what genetic test you're doing, it may not always be easy to pick this up. I mentioned that there are new technologies that are becoming increasingly adopted for diagnosis, and one example is nanopore long-read sequencing, and there's more being published on how this can be used to help with diagnosis in tough cases of muscular dystrophy. So the variants of unknown significance, sometimes if a genetic change is marked as a VUS, as we call it, say 5 or 10 years ago, and we go back and look up the variant now, several years later, we might find that there's more evidence about it and that it's actually assigned to a more definitive category, whether it's pathogenic, meaning disease-causing, or benign, which is not disease-causing. And going back and looking up some of the old variants, if you've had a genetic test a long time ago that was ambiguous, can sometimes provide helpful clues. There are projects that are funded by the NIH, such as ClinGen, that are really making progress towards resolving more of these VUSs, and we hope to have more definitive answers for more people in the future. So the goal, from my perspective, for diagnosis is to figure out a clear genetic diagnosis for every patient who has a clinical diagnosis of LGMD. That's not quite possible now, but how do we get there? Well, we need to really look carefully at clinical genetic test results, make sure that everything is interpreted as accurately as possible. Same thing for research genetic studies for those who go through research genetic studies. And then we do want to develop and utilize new online resources, as well as new modeling techniques for genetic variants. And then I also mentioned advanced sequencing technologies. So what we would like to do is shorten the diagnostic odyssey for some patients, which unfortunately for some can be many years and sometimes still inconclusive. And we'd really like to reduce that uncertainty and provide that knowledge for patients. Let's move on to current treatment options. Multidisciplinary care is really important. So MDA care centers, as an example, have a long history of being a mainstay of multidisciplinary care for individuals with LGMD. The specialists who staff these centers typically include neurology, cardiology, pulmonary, endocrinology, physical medicine and rehabilitation, physical therapy, orthopedic surgery, genetic counseling, and there are other specialists, of course, as well. And so it's very important for these patients to have access to multiple specialists who have expertise in muscular dystrophy. And this kind of clinic, a multidisciplinary clinic, is often a good place to receive this care. One question that periodically comes up is that steroids do help patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Do they also help patients with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy? And this has been studied, and so far there are hints that potentially for some subtypes of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy that steroids can be helpful. This isn't definitive yet, and steroids are not standard of care at this point for LGMD, but it's a question that's worth exploring, especially since there are newer steroids that have been approved recently, and there are more options in terms of steroid treatments and trying to navigate side effect profiles, which are a big limitation in the use of steroids. Cardiac monitoring is very important. Any individual with LGMD should have a baseline cardiac evaluation. Certain subtypes are known in particular to have increased risks of cardiac complications, and so this is an incomplete list because knowledge keeps evolving, but these are some of the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy subtypes that are known to have higher risks of cardiac complications. So for someone who falls into one of these categories, they likely do need ongoing cardiac surveillance. And then for somebody, even if they're not known to be in a higher risk category, if their baseline evaluation shows some problems, they may need to be followed more regularly and potentially receive treatment. And there are cardiac treatments available for arrhythmias and for cardiomyopathy. So these are treatable complications. So we do want to detect them as soon as possible. Pulmonary monitoring is also very important. A baseline pulmonary evaluation should be performed on all individuals with LGMD, and ongoing monitoring should be determined by the findings on baseline evaluation and the risk profile of the LGMD subtype. Any individual who is non-ambulatory is automatically at higher risk of respiratory complications, and so for anyone who is not able to walk, they should have regular pulmonary monitoring to be discussed with the specialist at your clinic. Let's go through research and clinical trials. What new therapies are being developed? Now, the MDA conference and clinicaltrials.gov provide numerous updates. There are different categories of therapies that are being developed. These include small molecules, gene therapy, and cell therapy. The future is bright but complex for new therapy development in LGMD. Let's discuss small molecules for a couple of minutes. Small molecules is a technical term for traditional drug compounds. What that means is that they're typically chemical compounds that often can be packaged into a tablet or a liquid to be taken by mouth. Not all of them can be taken by mouth, but a lot of them can be. So deflazacort is a steroid that was approved for DMD. And a prior study with one subtype of LGMD was not successful back in 2013. There's a case report that suggested potential benefit in 2010, but that was a limited number of patients. And then there's a clinical trial of using deflazacort in another subtype of LGMD that was terminated early due to low enrollment and missed visits. There is another compound, ribitol, also known as BBP-418, which is a substrate for the FKRP enzyme. Thus, at this time, it's specific to one subtype of LGMD, and there's a phase 3 trial that is ongoing. And there's another compound, EDG-5506, that's an inhibitor of fast skeletal muscle myosin. What that does is it protects muscle from stress as it's contracting and relaxing over and over again. And this is being studied right now primarily in Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, but also is being looked at for one subtype of LGMD. There is more gene therapy coming, and looking at clinicaltrials.gov can give you a very helpful indication of what's being studied and what studies are actively recruiting. So an exciting development is that gene therapy for DMD was approved in 2023, and there are others that are in development right now. And you can see that there are gene therapies in development for subtypes R2, R3, R4, R5, and R9. And these are studies at various stages of development. And there is one publication that came out just this year of a gene therapy for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy type R4. And I expect that there will be numerous other publications coming out in the near future, and hopefully some consideration of approvals. Just a little review of what gene therapy is. A lot of you have heard of the AAV vector, and that's refers to the adeno-associated virus. Right now, it is a very popular delivery vehicle for gene therapy because it has a fairly good safety profile. It certainly can cause some problems and complications, so it's not entirely risk-free, but compared to other vectors, it's fairly safe. It's been tested in humans numerous times now, so we're getting a better and better understanding of what the risk profile is. And lots of physicians and scientists are becoming more comfortable with this as a gene delivery vehicle. And The AAV, at least some of the subtypes, are naturally occurring viruses, and they're modified so that they can be used as basically delivery vehicles for genes or parts of genes. And so because of these modifications, they're really impaired in terms of replication. So one of the big worries about injecting viruses into humans is, will they replicate? Well, that risk is very minimal for AAV-based therapies, and that really helps with the safety profile. There are various ways you can modify this. So you'll hear different numbers being assigned or different letters being assigned to different subtypes of AAV, and that's because they've been modified in various ways, both to maximize safety and also to target the specific tissues, in this case, muscle, that we want to target. We can also go on to stem cell therapy. Stem cell therapy has a long history. It was studied in the early 1990s, and those were early myoblast studies, so not technically stem cells, but they were cell-based therapies. They were disappointing and didn't really show any benefit in the humans. So there was a big pause in terms of doing cell therapy in humans for a while. There were experiments that were done then in mouse and dog models for many years. And more recently, there's been a resurgence of interest in developing stem cell therapy for muscular dystrophy. At the University of Minnesota, we are developing cell therapy based on induced pluripotent stem cells. First, we plan to test it in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and then we would like to look at other muscular dystrophies as well. This is a diagram showing sort of the differences and the process for developing stem cell therapy for muscular dystrophy. And you can see that it's a complicated process. You have to take cells from a healthy donor based on the study that we're planning. And then you want to reprogram them into induced pluripotent stem cells. And that's a form of stem cell that can become another type of cell. And then those are differentiated into what we call myogenic progenitors, meaning that they still have a lot of flexibility in what they do as cells, but they're heading down the path of muscle development. And so that's what happens on the left with a donor. On the right side, you can see that there's another possibility, which is to take cells directly from the patient who has muscular dystrophy, modify it so that the cells have been corrected for the genetic issue, and then put back into the same patient. So this approach it has some unique, complicated features, but also has the benefit of using the same patient's cells. So you have to worry less about issues such as immune responses. Both approaches have benefits and risks that are distinct. And depending on the situation, one may be more appropriate than the other. And so just to highlight some of the differences, one donor could potentially treat numerous recipients in the allogeneic approach. That's when you have a donor that's unrelated to the patient. And then autologous is when the patient's cells are fixed and then reintroduced into the patient. And that's a one-by-one therapy, which is one of the complications of doing autologous therapy. And then we are planning to do a first-in-human clinical trial, and we hope to expand this to LGMD in the future. I would also like to highlight the GRASP LGMD network, and that stands for Genetic Resolution and Assessment Solving Phenotypes in LGMD. This is run out of Virginia Commonwealth University, and Nicholas Johnson is the overall head of this consortium, and it's supported by multiple sources. And you can see that there are sources all over the United States, as well as a couple of sites overseas. And in the future, I expect there'll be even more sites. These are some of the recent and current studies that are being done. And one of the helpful features of having all of these studies done on one platform is that it becomes easier to compare results from one study to another, and to also compare results from one subtype to another. So I would like to turn now to how to discuss treatment options with your doctor and care team. there are standard therapies, even if they're not FDA approved specifically for LGMD, that can really be helpful in terms of optimizing outcomes and being helpful in, regarding quality of life. So it's important to seek these therapies out. Usually the best place to seek out therapies and up-to-date information would be multidisciplinary care clinics that have expertise in muscular dystrophy. Now, I realize, and a lot of people realize, that these multidisciplinary clinics are not always easy to access. If you live far from the closest one, that may be difficult. And so we realize that these are not always as accessible as we would like them to be. When possible, it is helpful to consult them. And if you do live at a distance away, and it's feasible to go at least for occasional visits, that can be helpful also. And most multidisciplinary clinics, in my experience, are very comfortable coordinating care with local physicians and healthcare teams so that even those who live a little bit of a distance can receive good care. And so it's important to seek all the specialists and healthcare providers to cover all anticipated monitoring needs and complications. And so even though a multidisciplinary care clinic is an excellent place to get this, it's not the only place. So patients and families should seek out the best solutions for their individual situations. And I and many others recognize that circumstances vary a lot from family to family. It is important to ask your healthcare provider about any unexpected symptoms and any concerns about specific complications. It might be that there's a potential complication that we usually see in somebody who's 25 to 30 years old, but it may develop a little bit earlier or a little bit later. So, so it could be that it's an anticipated complication, but occurring in an unusual context. And once in a while, there could be a complication that is completely unexpected. While we know a lot about these diseases, there are still new discoveries being made, and especially with some of the rare subtypes, we may come across symptoms and complications that have not been described in the literature. So it is important to discuss anything that that seems unexpected with the appropriate healthcare provider. A neuromuscular neurologist can be very helpful in monitoring overall disease status. It is helpful in most cases to see numerous other specialists as well to at various recommended intervals. And typically you go for a baseline evaluation and then the specialist will recommend how often they might need to see you or what kind of interval is helpful, or at the very least, how soon the next visit should be. And there are cases when there'll be a baseline evaluation and it may not be necessary to go back to that specialist for a number of years. And there'll be other cases where they'll recommend pretty regular follow-up. So, so when in doubt, have a baseline evaluation done and discuss what kind of follow-up plan would be most appropriate for you. It's very important for us to all recognize that we're working together towards common goals. Patients and families, of course, being the most important. Patient organizations are really vital in terms of connecting patients and families with each other and also providing ways of connecting patients and families with healthcare providers, scientists, government agencies, and industry partners. What I've found over the course of my career, spanning now 20 years or so, is that there's increasing dialogue amongst all of these parties and stakeholders. And it's very important to enhance communication as much as possible because we all share common goals, and it's really important that we work together. So discussing trials with your healthcare team. If you see a new treatment or a clinical trial mentioned online or on social media or any other source that you have for information, don't be afraid to ask about it. You don't have to wait until your healthcare team brings it up. You can ask. It is helpful that, from my perspective, if someone brings a printout or some other information, because that'll help me do my own research if I know what the name of the treatment is or the name of the center that's sponsoring the trial or conducting the trial. Just remember your doctor and other healthcare team members, it's very hard for them to keep up with all the developments. So it's not a reflection on them if they are not aware of a specific study. If you bring up something first and they haven't heard about it, that's okay. As long as they're open to learning with you and partnering with you and exploring new possibilities. If you do contact a study site, feel free to ask all questions on your mind. Always ask about benefits and risks. And then for any individual patient or family, they will have a different benefit risk profile that's acceptable. There are some patients and families who really want to see a very favorable benefit risk profile before they will consider enrolling in a clinical trial. And then there are others who are a little bit more accepting of a higher risk trial. And so it's a little different for every family and every patient. So definitely think about this, think about what's important to your family and what you're willing to accept. And that's a very personal and private thought process that happens, but it's something that if you're comfortable sharing, then there are many people who can help you with that decision-making process. So where can you go for more information? The MDA is a great resource. There's a lot of information posted on the MDA website. The local MDA Care Center, if you have easy access to it. Clinicaltrials.gov is a government website. The Speak Foundation, among many other foundations, provides information about multiple subtypes of LGMD. And I could put up a list, but it would be very voluminous. And so if you look at some of these websites, you'll see links to other organizations, and you'll see that a lot of the organizations work with each other. And that's really what we like to see, is partnership and collaboration. Clinical research consortia like GRASP LGMD, which I mentioned, are also helpful sources of information. None of these organizations can guarantee the safety or efficacy of a specific study or treatment, so just keep that in mind. We try to provide the best information we can, and then work with you in terms of figuring out what decision is best for you about participation, about clinical trials, and about therapies in general. If you have any information on our research, we do a lot of genetic research, and also are looking more into stem cell therapies for treatments for muscular dystrophy. Feel free to contact me. Our neurogenetics contact email address is also listed. And these are lab members who have contributed to some of the publications that we had over the years on genetic information in muscular dystrophy, and these are their names. And these are some of the colleagues that I have in the Muscular Dystrophy Center here at the University of Minnesota. And they're helping a lot with the clinical studies that we are performing. And we have an MDA Care Center that is very active. And I do want to thank our funding sources for our research. And I'll look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Kang, for your great presentation today. And we do look forward to seeing you on September 30th for our Q&A. So thank you. We really appreciate your time and your support of MDA.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you.
Bye.
So if you are new to MDA and have been diagnosed with a neuromuscular disease under MDA's umbrella, or if you are a loved one of someone who is diagnosed, we encourage you to stay engaged with us at MDA. You can do this by visiting mda.org/join and completing a short form. Joining is free and will keep you up to date on the latest research, educational program, and supports. MDA's community education team would like to invite you to our upcoming in-person and virtual events. We are always adding more opportunities to learn with us, so use your QR code on the screen or check in the description box below to get involved with the MDA community. If you're watching from the future, not to worry. All of our virtual learning programs are available for on-demand viewing, and live educational opportunities are updated regularly at mda.org. You can learn more about these events by visiting our website. MDA will be hosting 4 in-person symposiums across the country. Join us for these half-day multi-session programs with both disease-specific learning and general learning sessions that are available to all neuromuscular diseases. As always, these events are free to the MDA community. We would love to hear your questions and comments about today's webinar. Please feel free to contact MDA's Resource Center at 1-833-ASK-MDA1 or email resourcecenter@mdausa.org. And we will be sure to get back to you. Thank you again to Dr. Kang for joining us. This concludes today's webinar. We'll see you on September 30th. Bye.